Thank you, Faye, for asking me to come along today and talk to you about that particular title, Instigating Even Greater Change Together. And I think we've heard some beautiful speeches this morning, and I'm sure you've had a great time in the workshop while I was just finishing my notes. Well done to Emily in the red here, easy to spot. I'm a natural rebel. I'm born into an Irish family, so rebellion and uprising is what we're all about. And even the mere thought of going to direct action fills me with excitement. I was slightly shaken as I was listening to you because I think it appeals to all of us. And actually, there is a lot to be said for direct action when it comes to change. I'm going to tie that in a bit later with the role of the engineer. I think in the world, one could view my role as a civil engineer as being somebody who potentially has the ability to destroy the environment. I like to think of us as being the people who will save the planet and change the environment and make all of our future choices about engineering driven from a climate perspective. And it's tough, you know, and I'll come back to that a bit later. Also, thanks to Michaela, who is incredibly modest about her ability to drive change and the change that she has brought into the schooling system in our county. And this is not only has she driven change through Form the Future in this county, it is now being looked at by the UK government as a way of driving change through the educational system in the UK. So well done, both of you. You are both in the forefront of driving change, which is exactly what this is all about. And we can all respond back to you, to your call to arms. You have given us both distinct calls to arms, and we can come forward to you, Emily, and unite with you. And we can come forward, Michaela, and join your ranks to speak openly at schools about our careers as engineers or doctors or teachers, or about what we think is important in the education system. So I think you have done a great job of calling us forward. I've been given by Faye a little bit of freedom to talk about my career, and a little bit, I'm going to tie that into my background and what drove me to become a civil engineer, because when I was 13, which is a long, long time ago, it wasn't necessarily a career choice for many women, and certainly where I grew up, it was non-existent as an option for me. It's a career that has given me utter joy, has physically and mentally exhausted me. I have broken bones, I have missing digits. I have mentally taken myself to a place that I don't think people should necessarily have to in their career. And at the same time, I can say that I would actively encourage other people to pursue it, and particularly for some of the reasons that Emily mentioned earlier. I'm going to go on after I've spoken to me a little bit about both the micro and the macro impacts and how I see that happening in change. And what I mean by that is the day-to-day actions that we might take for granted that we are doing, but we are driving positive change by them, or negative. And the same is true, as the lady spoke earlier, about some of the bigger drivers of change and calling to arms and taking direct action. This bit's easy. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I wanted to become a civil engineer and how that journey unfolded, if you like. At 13 years of age, I was sat on the North Downs in Folkestone, and I saw an enormous tunnelling. Well, I didn't know what it was. I saw an enormous machine arriving down the M20, blues and twos, the biggest low loaders the country has ever seen on a British road. And with it, this gigantic machine with teeth bigger than my head, and hundreds of them. And I ran down the hill and I asked, what is it? What on earth is this thing? And of course, it was the boring machine that was going to build the Channel Tunnel. Maggie Thatcher is in power, and Maggie Thatcher has she talked us into it. She has decided that we are going to build a connection to France through the Channel Tunnel. And the men who were offloading the machine, and you can imagine it was a rumpus, nobody knew how to even offload it. And there was press there, and people were milling around trying to even understand how to move this enormous thing with half a dozen cranes. And I said, and who are these people who will build this tunnel to France? And the first time, as a 13-year-old, I heard the term civil engineer. And I said, I will be one of those men. And so I did. I through various, which we could have a whole different discussion of. I know Rachel knows a little bit of my background as to why I'm interested in the homelessness issue in Cambridge. For various home reasons, I had a brother with mental health issues. My father, Irish father who'd moved to the UK, didn't like the idea, for very good reason, I think, at that time, of his daughter going into civil engineering and the engineering sector. So for a whole variety of reasons, I picked up a bag. I still can't believe it as an adult, and I left at 16. I then set about becoming financially independent so that I could then go to college and live and have somewhere to stay. So for a short period, I was living in crisis. I had nowhere to go, and I had no one. I became estranged from my family. That never gets any easier to say. And it was an enabler for me. It meant that I was choosing and taking a choice about the direction of my life and where it would go. And so I did. I had a lady who was very aware of my brother through the social support services, who became my champion. And when I said to her, I want to be a civil engineer, I have seen this machine and that's what I will do, she never doubted it. She never glazed over. She never looked like that's ridiculous. She said, of course, and we will support that. We will get grant funding. You will go to college. When you finish your college, you'll go to university. And then beyond that, you will be a civil engineer. And this belief system that I had access to as a 16-year-old child was incredible. So all of a sudden, I had one person in the world, one person who believed in me. And that drove me to go to college. She helped me to take a room in a family's home. And I, slightly shamefully and bashful to say it now, but I never engaged with that family, and I think it was driven from a place of shame. I had no possessions, I had nobody, I was on my own in the world, and so I waited until their lights went out, ate dinner in the kitchen, stood up, and got up and out the door before they ever got up. So I barely saw them, I would barely recognise them even today. And as an adult, I have tried to seek them out to say, thank you, you gave me shelter, but I've never found them, they've moved on. But I look back on that and it's, it sounds quite tragic, but what I was doing, I was focused on my career choices, on being an engineer, because I believed it would lift me out of, you could say poverty, but certainly out of crisis. And so I relentlessly pursued my education. Hence why, again, referring to Michaela earlier, that I have an active want and need to be involved in the education system in any way I can help with that. Having finished my BTEC National, which again is an interesting debate that we're having nowadays, should we all be going to university or should some of us be doing more broad spectrum educational system? We don't all have to go and do degrees. There are so many other routes and that are much more practical, and yet we're not opening the doors to those as much, and I think we should be. I absolutely adored my BTEC National. That got me onto my degree at Queen Mary in Westfield, part of the University of London. And, that's the normal going through a university system. I mean, it was a shock to somebody who'd come from a small town to arrive in London and then have 300 people in an auditorium for my lectures. But I think, we all go through university and see that. At the end of, in the second year of my university, I fortunately found myself a placement on the Jubilee Line extension at Westminster, which was, there's a long story as to how that happened, I won't go into that, but a lot of it is luck and a bit of having the balls to go on site and saying to the men covered in slurry, can I get a job with you? What can I do? Can I help? And I got a job as what they referred to as the chain girl, so the person who carries all of the weights and lifts the load. So it would normally be a chain man and boy, and I was that chain boy man, and I learnt the trade as to how to be a physical engineer on site. And in that year, they offered me, I became a very good setting out engineer. I had a team of 5 people, and I could go out and set out around Westminster. Westminster Station at the time was the biggest box excavation in London. It probably still is. And it's where you see those magnificent hanging escalators deep down into the Jubilee Line extension. So it was an unreal and amazing experience. And that's when I, with sheer exhaustion took the top off this finger by swinging a 14-pound sledgehammer, which I could hardly lift, to set out batter rails 13 floors below Westminster Station. And I think that is, that is part of the side of being a civil engineer who works as a contractor, that you are expected to perform like a man. I would be told every day, if you can't do it, I will find a man who can. And the Irish Rebellion would come up and and blood, sweat and tears, I would carry on until I lost digits, unfortunately. I don't think we should still be in this place. I think we've moved on a bit, not as much as I would like. Having done that, I went back to university, finished my degree. I then left with a work placement. I came out in '87. It was a recession, and people weren't getting jobs. Because I had a year's work experience, and I could use a theodolite, I could use dumpy levels, I could engage with a workforce. There was 300 men on that site and 1 girl. And because I had that experience, I could talk to people about what engineering meant in a profound way, which some of my student colleagues couldn't do. And so I naturally got a job ahead of them. Definitely not because of my academic ability. I'm very academically average, but I am driven and I have hopefully a good communication skills in the workplace. I joined AMEC as an engineer and had a fantastic career. So I started off at a young age in a think tank. So John Egan was revolutionary in the construction sector, and he decided that it wasn't acceptable in the construction sector to be so wasteful. So if you think about it, we are the last bastion of change, the construction sector. We were very wasteful environmentally. We were wasteful on people's budgets and people's time. So projects would go over 30% on cost. They would be 30% late on time. And it was about reclaiming that and saying, that's not good enough. And so Sir John Egan, who was the chief exec at the time of BAA, who used to own all the airports, drove this change. And he also drove the change that we'll start speaking to the young people. And as a 20-something-year-old, having finished university, I was part of his think tank. How do we reduce the cost of construction? And we worked tirelessly, and we actually saved the cost of construction by 30%. We were delivering on time, on budget, and most importantly, we'd stopped killing people. In my work life, I don't keep account of the amount of my friends and colleagues who have been killed on these big projects, on the M25, on the M11, on Westminster Station, on the Shard, although it was never attributed to the Shard because it was a cyclist and a lorry hit him and beheaded him outside my office. This was part of our working culture, and we drove a change that it is not acceptable to lose life while delivering infrastructure. And because BAA believed in that as the biggest infrastructure spender, we were able to drive that change. So some of the things that we take for granted now when we see construction going up was all driven off the back of that profile, because he gave the funding to allow that big driver of change. Somewhere along the lines in my chartership training, I had to have design experience. I'm not, as I said, a natural academic. I don't like sitting on my own and calculating and writing reports. So I was dragged by my ponytail into the design office, and I designed a £30 million taxiway in Edinburgh Airport, which is fantastic. I drove that environmentally, that we wouldn't build it as we'd built taxiways before. We would look to thin the pavement. We would look to reduce our natural resources as much as we physically could. We wouldn't put in artificial drainage systems which create floods later. We would use urban drainage systems where you dissipate it at source as opposed to putting it into an outfall and capturing it somewhere else later that floods. So we went through this enormous change. And I remember my colleagues would say to me, why do you have to make everything so hard? Why can't you just accept one thing as it is? And I couldn't. And there you are. I've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to skip on a bit. So that's my career in engineering, and I went on to become the construction director for a £2 billion job in Ireland. I was a construction director here. I have rebuilt personally almost every runway in the UK, certainly the 7 largest, and I've built many roads, bridges, tunnels, all the rest of it. So it's been an amazing career, and I'm now currently, I keep my hand in engineering, so I'm now building a hotel for the university as their independent chair. I'm going to touch just briefly on health and why that became relevant to me. I think it's always been relevant to me, but more relevant, and how I feel that we can all drive these changes. I was diagnosed post my second child turning 1 with breast cancer. And I didn't just get breast cancer, I got a very aggressive form of breast cancer that, say, 6 years ago, I understand there wasn't a treatment available. And I can't even put into words the shock and horror that that presented me with. I, fortunately, with the evolution of targeted therapies, which were incredibly good at physiologically at beating it, I went through a chemotherapy, radiotherapy, surgery, and targeted therapies for a year, and here I am, so thank God. Through that process, which takes you down, it destroys all the fast-acting single cells in your body, and you are stripped. My skin was stripped. I was obviously bald and all over my body. But what you don't perhaps realise through chemotherapy, I had lost the nerve endings in my hands and feet. I could hardly walk or move. I swallowed liquid morphine just to be able to... I couldn't speak for about 8 or 9 days of every 3-week cycle, which for somebody who likes to talk Irish was awful. I would bang my fist on the table and say, "Robert, listen," and he'd wave goodbye. Oh my God, she can't speak. There is some benefit in this chemo. So it gave him a few weeks off, but I was quite violent. I would also say that a lot of the drugs that you're given at that time have a massive impact on your mental health, on how you perceive the world. Your level of stress and anxiety goes through the roof. And so having lived like that for a year and been taken to a place where I feel I was barely living. Did I have a quality of life? I think not. But every day I got up, I'm a positive person, and I would positively get myself up. You made the bed. Well done, you. You got out to the deli to have a coffee. Well done, you. And I spent every day celebrating my successes. I wasn't building runways now, but I was living day to day and celebrating every single milestone. If I made a nutritional meal for my family, I would applaud myself. And that's what it comes down to, I think, is always keeping positivity about whatever you're able, remembering it is still fantastic. At the end of my treatment, I looked for rehabilitation. I was now mentally and physically broken, and I had had world-leading cancer care in Cambridge. And where was my rehabilitation? And the answer was, there is none. You are fixed. Goodbye. Off you go. Have a great life. And I hope we never see each other again. It's like the Stockholm syndrome. I was absolutely terrified to be left to go back into the world. And what was this world? And who was I now? And nobody talked to me about that. And what about all this shit that's going on in my head? How do I silence this? You know, will it come back? Will it kill me still? What will that look like? You know, all of those things. Who's going to help me silence that? And the answer was nobody. I was obviously referred to the cancer services, Maggie's and the Cambridge Cancer Centre, and they are fantastic and they are incredibly helpful. But could I be physically rehabilitated and told how to live? And the answer was no. And so just to sort of finish off on that, I was given by the Nuffield 12 weeks with a personal trainer. And in 12 weeks, I went from barely able to cross this floor. I was shaking, still bleeding. I would bleed from the nose, the corners of my mouth, because the skin was gone. My hands would bleed. I had no nails. They were black and gone. So I was bleeding everywhere. And to go to a gym when you're still bleeding and shaking was a shock. And I thought, she's mad. It's too early. But she got me onto a tread machine, and over 12 weeks, I could run 5K to my complete amazement. I could do a HIIT workout, a kettlebell workout, and I was up there at some of the fittest people in the UK who have been through fitness testing. So it was incredible. At the same time, I embarked on a 10-week mindfulness course at the Cancer Centre, the David Rayner Centre. And this did all of those things about helping me to alleviate that anxiety and not worry and ruminate about what might come back, but just accept that I am alive, I am well, I control this day, and to be much more understanding about what I can and can't influence. It was amazing. I also learnt how to eat well. and combine really good food, making time to plan your meals and making nutritional food for me and my family, and the importance that would have on my long-term survival. So I combined all of these elements, and I asked the Nuffield if they would partner with me to produce a 12-week full holistic cancer rehabilitation program. We started as breast cancer. We called ourselves Bosom Buddies because, as Michaela said earlier, the buddying system I'm a huge supporter of. I think we're all here to buddy each other in life. And we set up this course. We have put our first cohort through it. They are about 48% less perceived depression, 43% less perceived stress and anxiety. They all have 100% return to mobility. I was told by Adam Brooks it was unlikely post my mastectomy that I would ever do any of this. I have it all. In fact, they've said it's about 110%. I'm slightly hypermobile now. I'm hyper everything, I think. I feel, you know, we have a life, we have to live it. So, you know, what drove me to that change was there wasn't something there and I needed it. And I think as women, we're really good at that. We see something we want and we need and our friends need and our parents need or someone needs and we just fix it. It's what we do. And I think that's the power of these conferences. It's about saying, of course we can do it. What do I know about the healthcare sector? I can tell you, heck all. What do I know about cancer? I've got lived experience, that means something, but otherwise, heck all. And so I never pretend that I know. I normally, when I talk about my course, I say, I know nothing. And this is true, but all of these people that I have employed and who are working with me and partnering with me, they are the experts, and they know. And so that's what it's all about. Sometimes it's just about getting the right people together to drive that change. And it is in all of us. So I've gone way over my time, and thank you. So thank you very much.